At the end of this lesson, you will interpret the calibration markings on the adjustable height rod of a physician mechanical beam scale, and determine the height indicated on height rods with and without the number of feet indicated on the rod. Let's begin. Here are the parts of the height rod that we will focus on today: the lower rod with the indicator line and the upper rod with the headpiece. The lower rod, also called the outer rod, is stationary and cannot be adjusted. The upper rod, also called the inner rod, is the adjustable portion of the height rod. It can be raised and lowered as needed. The headpiece, which is currently in its resting position, extends and is placed on top of the patient's head during height measurement. The indicator line is also called the read line. Some rods also include a read arrow. You will determine the patient's height by observing the indicator line and calibration markings. Here's a general overview of how the height rod works. The patient steps on the platform. Raise the height rod so the headpiece is above the patient's head. Lower the headpiece onto the patient's head. Make sure the headpiece is flat. If it is slanted downward or upward, you will produce an inaccurate result. Remember, make sure the headpiece lays flat atop of the patient's head. Now that you have a general concept of how the height rod works, we will now focus on interpreting the calibration markings on the height rod. The lower rod is generally used for those who have a standing height of less than 3 feet 4 3/4 inches. Let's look at each of the calibration markings on the lower rod closely. We will focus only on the right side of the rod since our concentration is in feet and inches and not in centimeters. Notice that you have lines for feet, inches, and fractional inches. The fractional lines represent quarter, half, and 3/4 completely. Let's see if you can master the upper rod as well. Remember with the bottom rod, the numbers increase from bottom to top? Well, on the upper rod, the numbers increase from top to bottom. Let's see why this makes a difference. We will compare the fractional lines between 2 and 3 inches on the bottom rod and the top rod. On the bottom bar in the left image, the fractional line that represents the 2 1/4 inch mark is here. The 2 1/2 inch mark is here, and the 2 3/4 inch mark is here. Now on the upper bar in the right image, the fractional line that represents 2 1/4 inches mark is here, the 2 1/2 inch mark is here, and the 2 3/4 inch mark is here. Remember, the bottom rod numbers increase from bottom to top. The upper rod numbers increase from top to bottom. The simplest way to interpret the calibration markings correctly is to observe the direction that the whole numbers are increasing. Then you will be able to interpret the fractional markings correctly. Now here's some good news. If you're measuring someone who is taller than the height of the bottom rod, you can ignore the numbers on the bottom rod completely and focus on the upper rod and indicator line. For the rest of this lesson, we will focus on using the upper rod and reading from the indicator line. Now that you have learned the basics, let's determine a patient's height in feet and inches. In this image, the patient's height is 5 foot 3 1/2 inches. Here's how this was determined. Once the patient is on the platform with the headpiece flat on their head, follow these steps. Step 1. Find the number of feet nearest to the indicator line. In this case, it is 5 feet. Step 2. Find the nearest whole number in inches. In this case, it is 3 inches. Step 3. Find the fractional inch closest to or on the indicator line. In this case, it is in 1/2 inch. And step 4, document the final result. In this case, you will document the height as 5 foot 3.5 inches. And there you have it. You have learned to interpret the calibration markings on the adjustable height rod of a physician mechanical beam scale, and determine the height indicated on the height rods with and without the number of feet indicated on